Hello everyone, how are you doing? So in this video I am going to show you how I painted a wood elf from Atlantis Minis. In fact, it's the Rogue miniature from Atlantis Miniatures, part of their wood elf collection. So as soon as I saw that they were releasing these, I got on the Kickstarter. They arrived earlier this year and I've just got around to painting them. I got 6 of them in total and I've painted them all, so those videos are going to come out over the next few weeks. These were just beautiful figures to paint. I'm not sponsored by Atlantis Minis. You know, these are ones that I saw and I wanted to buy. I will say that whilst the Kickstarter backers received them a little while ago, they've just released on their store, so you can buy them. They're just really well made. They just have really fantastic detail, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to go over how I painted it up, like I say, and show you the glorious details on this figure. I'll show you which paints I use, and also I'll be concentrating mostly on the cloak and maybe a bit more on the face, and with the other videos I'm going to concentrate on other areas of the different figures so that you get to see them all. So with that, yeah, I hope you enjoy this video. Give me a like, subscribe, that'd be awesome. Tell your friends, woo! And yeah, and I'll see you down at the table, shall we? Okay, so what I did was I started with a zenithal highlight undercoat. So I painted it black and then I used a white ink through an airbrush, which I sprayed from above so that I could catch the highlights, figure out where the highlights are, and obviously I noted where the highlights and the lowlights were so that I knew where to paint the shadows. I started with the trousers and I did these a brown, so this was granite hide from Citadel, and I just give them a paint over. I was trying to be careful not to go over the details, but you know, this is a fairly rough coat. You want to make sure that you've got your paints fairly well watered down. You don't want a thick coat, because otherwise the zenithal highlight, you can use the picture for reference, but you know, it's almost a waste of time if you do a really thick layer. Plus these models are so beautiful, they've got such great detail, and even around the trousers they have all these stitching marks and stuff like that. It's the details are just absolutely glorious, and so I wouldn't want to lose that detail. So make sure you thin your paints down, and that'll help you see the zenithal highlights underneath, and it'll also make sure that you can still see the details on the miniature, and that's what we really want to do here. If we've got a high quality mini like this, let's make sure we preserve as much of that as we can. And it's the same with your undercoat, of course. You know, don't go too thick, which is why I use an ink actually through an airbrush for my zenithal highlights. And then I think it was, I'll put a picture in the link, but I believe it was Caliban green that I painted the cloak. On the cloak there is actually details. Again, you've got the stitching, but you've also got these sort of logos which are sort of embossed or recessed depending on where it is on the different figures. And I wanted to make sure that I preserved that as well. So again, keep your paints thinned down. So I just went over all the details, and it's always nice at this stage, isn't it? You paint your model with the base coats and you start to see where your colour scheme's going, and yeah, for me that's just really nice. I should say you're thinning these paints down, so it might be that you need a couple of coats to really get the opacity you want, but again, we want to try and preserve some of that zenithal highlight shading and highlighting underneath. Then with the boots, I just painted these black, so the idea was that they're going to be black leather, so I'll highlight them later. Oh, with the black I also made sure I used that on the gauntlets and some of the other details. So there was like this cloth sash skirt type thing, and for that I used, I think it was Thunderhawk blue. And then of course there's details like the belt and the weapon and things like that, but I'm not gonna go into those. So yeah, I painted this Thunderhawk blue, and I thought it was a nice little contrast. It's still fairly muted, and it still works well with the colour scheme for what is a sort of rogue or assassin. I then went over the skin, so I blocked in the initial skin details. Again, keep your paints thinned down, it means that you can get more details out, especially on the face. And yeah, I went over all this. I'll put the paint that I used for the base paint. I think it was Gisela Flesh, the idea being that they're a fairly light skin colour, and just blocked in the skin. Yeah. Now once I'd done this, it was really important for me to... So I wasn't using washes on this. I was actually trying to... I'm trying to get away from using washes on bigger details. And so what I did was that I took a darker green and I put that in my wet palette, so keep it fairly thin and wet. And so I put the darker colours in the recesses. Now hopefully you can still see the contrast through the zenithal highlight showing through. And so I put the darker paints in the recesses. So I start with putting, a thin layer right in the very inside, and then I build up layers, but I feather it out so that I'll do the first layer just on the inside, then the second layer will be a bit wider, the third layer will be a bit wider again. If you keep it thin, then it'll make a really nice gradual, like I say, it'll feather out as it transitions into the base paint colour. And I actually do a very similar thing with the highlights as well. So you basically go in reverse. So there I'll actually start with a slightly lighter tone and build my highlights out. So again, using the thinnest at the highest point, the highest highlight, and then I'll do a thin layer, and then I'll do a slightly thicker layer and a slightly thicker layer. And so hopefully what you end up with is a gradual transition from light to dark across the cloak. And like I say, just think about how the cloak folds, think about where the light is going to hit, and think about, you did zenithal highlighting probably from one side, so think about is certain parts of the cloak going to have more highlight than others. And then once I've done the slightly lighter tone, then I'll start using the lightest tone as well, so I'll really build up those highlights. But of course at this point you start keeping it thinner. Another thing, if you've got the wet palette, what's nice is you can have the medium tone and the lighter tone, and you can blend them, and so that you can use the particular gradient of mixture on your miniature where you want it. Like I say, by the time you get to the highest highlights, the top of folds on the cloak, and especially on the hood, which we'll look at shortly, we want to pick out some of those details, and hopefully by blending in these different layers, the darker layers and the lighter layers, hopefully you'll be able to see the folds in the cloak even if you're not that close. And that's the beauty of highlighting. I mean, that's why you do it. What's nice about these models is that they've got really nice details, but it's not over the top, it's actually really natural folds where the cloaks fall and stuff like that, and the way all the folds in the hood and around the neck. I think it's just a really nice cast, and this was a particularly great cloak for painting. I just really enjoyed it. So yeah, with it I do like to really pick out, with the lightest colour, I do like to pick out the very tops of the folds, the edges of the cloak down the sides and maybe around the bottom. But again, I would try and do it where it most makes sense, where it's most likely to catch the light. And here what you can see that I'm doing is that I'm working on the top of the cloak and the hood of the cloak, and this was where my zenithal highlight was brightest. So this is where I want the widest highlights, this is where I want the most highlights. So I'm really imagining that the sun is hitting it from one side, from the top, and so use that as your brightest point. That's your brightest point there, and then work it out. So there'll be more of the highlight in that area, and then as it moves back and away, or as the cloak folds back, you'll have less of the highlight. And so it's just, really trying to, like I say, replicate exactly what we did with the zenithal highlight underneath, and that's why it's a good idea to take a picture of that. And I'm going to do a really similar thing with the trousers, So again, I'm taking a darker tone and I'm feathering it out. I'm putting it into the recesses, into where the leg folds, where the trousers fold. Any sort of, there's actually sort of stitching lines down the side of the trousers, so I'm putting that darker tone in there. and just using that as yeah, that's my low light and feathering it out, and then I'm going with the highlights. And so obviously one of the legs is straight down. It's probably not going to get that much sun, it's not going to get that much reflection, that much light, whereas the knee of the one that's on the top of the branch, that's going to catch quite a bit of light just because of where it is. And with the zenithal highlights, the way where I've said that the highest point on the hood is, there is actually, the light would continue and highlight a particular part of the knee, so I've tried to replicate that in my painting. Now I will say I haven't really shown you this, but I'll show you a picture. So the embossed sort of highlight, the detail that's on the cloak, I painted this, and I painted it sort of turquoisey, but what I tried to do was I didn't just do it one colour, because you've got the folds of the cloak, but then if you just paint the details one flat colour, you're going to ruin that illusion, you're going to ruin what you've done with this highlighting. So I actually paid careful attention to highlight in the same places and low light in the same places on that detail embossed image on the cloak. I made sure that I replicated what was in the green. I replicated that when it came to that detail to make sure that it didn't remove the illusion. And then also I did use a little bit of a dark brown wash around the stitching on the trousers just to really make sure they popped. There's a lot of small details, and it's quite hard for me to really pick that out just by low light painting alone, so I used a bit of wash in there, and then I actually used a light brown to give a really high light highlight on the stitching and also on the seams of the trousers. So yeah, I was quite pleased with how it all came out. And in a similar way to what I'd done with the highlighting on the cloak and with the trousers, you know, I highlighted with the boots, with the belt, with the sort of skirt thing at the front at the belt area. So again, you know, going through, none of these were in areas where they were likely to catch as much light as my highest highlight on the knee and on the hood. So I paid attention to that, but you don't just want one flat colour, so I made sure that I highlighted different areas and just put a bit of variation across it. And you don't need to be too accurate, you know. Sometimes if you're trying to just give a bit of tonal detail to, say, the boots or to the belt, and maybe they don't have that much detail there, maybe there aren't really defined folds, you can be quite liberal. If you're using thin paints, you can just do sort of slashes and it'll just give it texture, it'll add texture to it. And you can also sort of do this by stippling on as well. So the rope is a really nice detail, so I started with a very sandy colour for this. It was a fairly sort of muted yellow sandy colour, and once I painted that again, it's easier for me at my level of painting to use a wash in this rather than try and paint the low light. So I went over it with a brown wash, and that really brings out the individual wrappings of the rope. And then what I did was I went back in with the original paint colour, again watered down on my wet palette, and started to just try and bring out those individual strands. And then once I'd done that, I went in with a lighter colour and highlighted the very tops of each of those twists, but also, again, because of where my highlights were originally, the zenithal highlights, there's certain areas of the rope that are going to be more bright than others that are maybe on the inside. So you want to highlight I want to bring out highlights and show the details across the whole of the rope, but certain areas are going to have more of the bright highlights, and maybe even some of the rope that's on the inside of the loops, maybe that highlight is actually going to be the highlight is going to be the base colour on the inside because you don't have as much light. So just again, think about where your highlights are going. It's always worth having a look at your mini as you go along, just seeing what you've done. you know, just look at it. Does it look like? Now I will say, you know, I've talked a lot about the highlights, but I still sometimes I'll put a slight highlight in a place where maybe it doesn't make the most sense, but I want to make sure that it brings out the details. So I try and, you know, I'm not perfect with this, let's be absolutely honest, so I try and stick to these highlights, but at the same time you want to be able to see the details. So again, just being able to look at the model and consider it is worth doing. And then I realised that with the rope, I actually went back in, once I'd done the highlighting, I actually went back in with a bit of Agrap's Earthshade wash by Citadel, and I just used very pointed placement of that wash just to really put it in the winds of the rope, and then you can, you know, go back in with the highlights a little bit. So coming back to the skin, I'm not necessarily going to go over the skin too much, that'll be in another video. In this video I wanted to concentrate on cloaks and highlights, but you're using very, very similar techniques for the face, and so I don't use a wash at this stage for skin. I'm starting with my base colour, and then I'm going in with a dark low light. Bugman's Glow is my darkest low light, and because this is more pinky but it is a darker colour, so again make sure you keep it low. And so you want to be putting this around the, you know, the outside of the nose, in the underneath the cheeks, maybe on the bottom of the chin, where the nose and the furrows of the eyebrow are. You want to put some low lights in there and just feather it out, and then you can go back in and just sort of feather over with your original colour, but then you can go lighter and lighter as well until, you know, the bridge of the bottom of the nose is going to have the highest highlights. Maybe the bridge of the eyebrows, definitely the top of the cheeks are going to have the highest highlights, and the chin. So just think about, you know, if you've ever taken a selfie and you see that your face looks like super shiny and stuff, which areas was it that had those brightest highlights? I'll go back in a few times with the low lights and the highlights and sort of blend and the midtones until I just get it looking right, where, you know, that I think that the low lights are in the right place, the highlights are in the right place, but you can't see the obvious transitions between those layers. You know, you want it to be a gradual shift. Maybe where the nose is, then underneath the nose there will be a harder, you know, there'll be a very clear distinction underneath the nose with a darker colour compared to the top of the nose, which is a lot more prominent because that's an edge. Whereas if it's going on the cheeks, you want the you know, you'll have slightly darker underneath the eyes, and that'll come lighter and lighter, but it'll do so gradually, and then as it drops underneath the cheeks, it'll be a fairly quick transition, but not as quick as, like, say, that sharp transition between the nose, because it is a curved surface, so it's gonna blend, and the light blends as well as our paint or maybe makeup does. So yeah, and then it's trying to add in some details, you know, trying to add furrow to the brow. Now I haven't gone over painting the eyes, but what I do is that I actually paint the eyes before I do the face. So I go in with a off-white, a pallid witch flesh, I think it is, I'm forgetting the names, but I will have pictures here. I use that as the base, so I want that over the whole of the eyeball. Then I might go in with maybe a bit of Reichland Flesh shade and just dip it on, and just a little tiny amount just to go around the edges, just because around the edges of the eyes you tend to have sort of more of a pinkish colour. And then I'll go back in with that pallid witch flesh and just re-bring out the eyeball apart from the very edges of it. Then I try and put a dot of an iris colour in there. So these minis are good enough that you can put an iris in there. So for some of them I used a fairly bright green, some of them I used a fairly bright blue, some browns. It's not particularly obvious, it's really hard to see. It's only when you really look closely at the eyes you can see that there's an iris, and then in the middle of that I put a pupil. Again, it's really hard to see, it's not necessarily all that obvious, you've got to look, but when you do look you see that there's more detail in the eye than you thought, and again, because these models are so well made, you can actually get that level of detail in there. And then also don't forget to paint up the hair with highlights as well. There isn't much hair on this one. And also eyebrows. If you don't put eyebrows on the face, it's going to look a little bit weird, so that should be maybe a little bit lighter than the hair colour. On this miniature I painted the hair black with sort of grey grey for highlighting, so then that's what I also did with the eyebrows, although I started with a dark grey rather than a black, because it's just, if it was very black it'd look a little bit weird. And again, the casting is good enough on this model that you can see where the eyebrows should be. And you know, if you go a little bit wide, then go back in with the flesh colours, you know, and bring it back. You know, going a little bit over where you want the eyebrows to be doesn't wreck the mini. You can fix that using the others, and sometimes that's the best way of doing it. The eyes and the eyebrows I might end up doing 3 or 4 times until I get it right. Of course, if you realise that you've gone too far straight away, then you can splash it with a whole bunch of water so that the paint doesn't dry, and then you can wipe it off with a cotton bud or some paintbrush. And yeah, just to finish off, I don't think I showed you me painting the weapon, but I sort of used non-metallic techniques for that, for the glow, but I did use metallic with it, so I used a black metal and some silvers and stuff to get a really nice glow. And then the actual base, you know, our friend here is stood on a log, and so I painted it up with some browns. I'll put the colours that I used. For the base, I was less worried about the log than I was, say, the figure itself. You know, you don't have to spend all the time going over all the details on every part of the mini. Sometimes it's best to concentrate on particular areas. And so this will be, you know, I'll paint it, then I went over it with a wash, and then it'll be maybe a bit of a dry brush and just making sure that it looks right. And then I put it on a bottom as well, so that when it's on the table it won't fall over. And so yeah, there you have it. That's pretty much how I made this model, how I painted it. I stuck in a little bit of green wash in the underside of the tree as well to simulate moss, but yeah, that's how I painted this model. It took me a bit of time, but it didn't take me too much time, and I was painting other minis at the same time, so I was batching certain types of colours while other colours dried, and yeah, it was just a real pleasure to paint. And there will be more of these miniatures afterwards, so I think I got 6 of these minis from this range. I wish I could have afforded all of them, but I don't have loads of money, and so I'll be showing you how I painted up the others and concentrating on different areas as I go through them. Maybe it'll be the tattoos, maybe it'll be the bases, maybe it'll be the skin. So with that, thanks so much for watching. Maybe like, maybe subscribe, and I'll see you soon, I hope. Take care. Bye bye.